early days of the war in the Pacific, an American skipper confronts unexpected threats to his submarine.
At that time, probably that was regarded as pretty serious damage.
And to his crew.
I think they have very few information about the Japanese in the early warning picket ships.
As they set out to thwart Japanese expansion in the Pacific. In World War II, a subsea weapon allows warriors to fight from beneath the waves. With cunning, force, and tenacity, their enemies strike back. Revolutionary, but still sometimes primitive. It's a desperate bid to change the course of war. Their stories are legend. May 10th, 1942. An American submarine approaches its assigned area in Japanese home waters. Lookouts spot an enemy vessel only 4 miles away.
Get the captain!
It is the first war patrol of both USS Silversides and Lieutenant Commander Creed Burlingame.
37-year-old Burlingame is one of the Navy's new generation of skippers. He was a swashbuckler. In fact, Time magazine had called him that during the 1940s. Like a lot of skippers during this time period, he lacked any combat experience at the start of the war, but he more than made up for that with a desire to want to exact revenge upon the Japanese for the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Burlingame decides the small boat does not warrant an expensive torpedo. He expects Silverside's deck gun will do the job. From its crew of 70, young officers and sailors hustle to their battle stations for the first time.
Stand by deck gun. Leveled up!
Their 3-inch 50 caliber gun can fire 24-pound armor-piercing shells at up to 3 rounds per minute, at a range of nearly 15,000 yards.
The weather is awful this day. Gray skies, heavy seas. The gunners that are racing around on deck are struggling basically to stay upright.
Burlingame unleashes his attack.
Fire! Fire!
But the Japanese boat returns fire, and a gun battle erupts.
Elevate 15! Fire! Fire!
The Ebisu Maru No. 5 is a 131-ton wooden fishing trawler. Even civilian ships like fishing boats have been armed to defend Japan.
At that time, Japan had no radar. So a simple method for Japan, Imperial Japanese Navy, is to use the land-based naval aviation for the area patrol. But there are huge gaps. So Yamamoto put several picket boats lined, mainly about 150 degrees east. The distance from mainland Japan to that area is about 800 nautical miles. So long enough to provide Japan the early warning.
Fire!
Japanese machine gun bullets whiz past the sailors and ping off the conning tower.
Basically, they are armed, mainly the machine guns and 2 or 3, the depth charges. And of course the radio. I don't think the Silversides had the right idea of the mission of the ship.
Burlingame has underestimated the enemy.
So at this point, it's all hands on deck. Not only are the gunners working topside, but crews down below are literally ripping open ammunition boxes and forming an ammo chain to hand these projectiles up from the submarine all the way up so that they can be fired from the gun. As the gunfight is unfolding, the crew's shots are getting more and more accurate. So they're actually punching into this Japanese trawler, and it suddenly erupts in flames. Rather than run away, ultimately turns and starts charging toward the Silversides.
The Ebisu Maru continues to fire its machine gun on the submarine.
So the crew on deck is having to take cover as bullets are literally zinging past.
Fire!
One of these bullets ultimately hits one of the men in his helmet, and he says it's like a sledgehammer. It knocks him down, knocks him out.
Despite the injury, the ammo chain continues, the shells passing from hand to hand. But then another crew member, Mike Harbin, turns to pass a shell to the next loader in line when he is hit too.
It takes a second. Mike Harbin drops to the deck, and the other crews continue to hand the shells off one after the other. And then everybody stops and looks down and realizes that Mike Harbin has gone down, and there's blood coming out on the deck around him.
In shock, the crew freezes, despite the ongoing firefight.
To snap them out of it, Worthington unholsters his pistol, lowers it by his side, and he shouts to the men, "Get back on that damn gun, or I'll shoot everyone."
Let's move now! Load it, let's go! Keep firing fire! Faster, go! Keep moving! Keep fire!
Finally, engulfed in flames, the picket boat stops firing. Burlingame calls off the attack and expects it to sink, but it does not. In the first battle of their first patrol, a crew member has been killed.
It's something that haunts Burlingame. The Ebisu Mara wasn't worth the price of a torpedo, but in the end, it cost much more.
Throughout 1942, the Japanese looked to consolidate their hold on the Pacific.
Japan wanted to make the war as short as possible. Australia is one of the largest obstacles for the Japanese war effort because it's so close to the South China Sea. Australia has a huge potential to be the base camp to make the counterattack against Japan. So Japanese next step is to isolate Australia. Japanese Navy started building the air bases at the southern tip of the Solomons Island. That's the Guadalcanal. That's the strategic spot to control that area from the air.
To halt Japanese expansion, on August 7th, 6,000 American Marines land on Guadalcanal to seize the island.
The first offensive the United States mounts in the Pacific is Guadalcanal. In itself, Guadalcanal is not where you'd really like to be, but Guadalcanal is a place from which you can get further. If you know it matters, it means that you'll fight for it. And that grinds down a fair amount of the Japanese Navy. They inflict very serious losses on us.
By November, the numbers are staggering. The Japanese have landed over 30,000 troops. Many quickly become casualties. They continue to fight to retain control, despite the brutal standoff. Reinforcements will prove critical. On December 17, 1942, USS Silversides departs the American submarine base at Brisbane, Australia. They head to an area south of the island of Truk on their fourth war patrol. Lieutenant Commander Burlingame's submarine must prevent Japanese supplies and reinforcements from reaching Guadalcanal.
Burlingame and his crew have come a long way in the 8 months since their first patrol. They've gone from being a young, inexperienced group of sailors to being hardened veterans. They've survived depth charge attacks, aerial bombs, they've lost one of their own crew members. All of this has made them a tight-knit crew.
Five days into the mission, Silversides passes by the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul, New Britain.
In order for Japan or Yamamoto to really cut the communications between Australia and the United States, and also to guarantee the safety of the South China Sea, at the very beginning of the war, the Yamamoto sent a carrier force to take Rabaul.
As Silversides powers deeper into enemy territory, 22-year-old pharmacist mate Tom Moore has been up since 4 a.m.
How you doing? Heard you're not doing
Several
well.
sailors have been suffering from nausea since they left Brisbane.
A pharmacist's mate's job description is pretty much what it is now. In World War II, they were trained in first aid. They could suture wounds. They could treat colds, they could treat minor illnesses, that type of thing.
But one patient is different. 18-year-old Petty Officer 3rd Class Fireman George Platter complains of sharp pain in his abdomen. Moore assigned bed rest as he did with the others. But hours later, Platter's condition worsens. His pain is more intense. The pharmacist's mate starts to worry. Moore thinks he knows the diagnosis: acute appendicitis, a serious medical threat in a world without antibiotics.
If you had an ill shipmate who had appendicitis and you let it go to any length of time, if it became acute appendicitis, the appendix would burst, and that was essentially a sentence of death.
Moore believes Platter requires surgery.
He's got appendicitis.
He asked Burlingame to request a flying boat, an aircraft that can land in water, to collect Platter and fly him to Australia for the emergency operation. Burlingame must decide whether to expose the submarine and its crew to evacuate the patient or risk losing another sailor on his watch. But he realizes that even requesting an evacuation could alert the Japanese to their presence. Burlingame decides against the request. By 9 p.m., Platter's condition is critical. The pharmacist's mate, Tom Moore, believes Platter will die.
Sir, it's Platter. He's not doing too well.
Moore and Burlingame debate the unthinkable.
His appendix.
In order for George Platter to survive, he must have his appendix removed aboard a submarine in enemy waters without a surgeon. It is very risky.
Even with skilled surgeons, it was considered a complex procedure. Because antibiotics were not available, you could die even if you were operated upon by a skilled surgeon.
And Moore has never performed surgery himself. To do so without training violates all professional standards and official Navy orders.
Do what you gotta do.
Yes, sir.
Operating would put Moore at risk of being court-martialed. But Platter could die if he doesn't. Moore must weigh the options and make the call. December 1942. A crew member aboard the American submarine USS Silversides has appendicitis and may not survive without evacuation from the sub. Without a surgeon on board, the pharmacist's mate risks court-martial if he performs the operation. Despite all the risks, Tom Moore decides to perform the surgery. They prepare the submarine to become an operating room.
A World War II submarine that has very little sterile anything on it. These guys are breathing diesel fumes all the time. The water is not the best. It's a closed, confined environment.
Burlingame orders Silversides to dive about 50 miles off Rabaul, a key Japanese naval base. Slipping beneath the dark water, they level off at a depth of 100 feet. The submarine sits vulnerable to enemy ships and aerial surveillance all around. It's unnerving while on active patrol, let alone aboard a floating operating room.
The skipper of Silversides, Lieutenant Commander Creed Burlingame, he supports Tom Moore any way he can. He tells Moore, I'm going to take the boat down to 100 feet, 120 feet, so it'll be stable, it won't be rocking and yawing this way and that, and you'll have a stable platform.
Moore will operate with his assistants, a radio operator, a signalman, a gunner's mate, and second-in-command Roy Davenport. They squeeze into the cramped wardroom. A narrow rectangular dining table bolted to the floor to weather rough seas is their operating table.
The instruments Moore has on the submarine, he has scalpel blades, he has a scalpel handle, he has suture material, he has gauze that he can use for sponges. He doesn't have retractors, which are going to be needed for the surgery, but he has a machinist's mate take some spoons and bend the handles back. So he has his retractors, and he has some Novocaine, which he's going to use for his spinal anesthetic.
Moore measures 150 milligrams of Novocaine.
He does know the spinal procedure because he's assisted many times in the past. He rolls the patient on his side with assistance from one of the other people on his team, And they find the place where the needle needs to be inserted, and he puts the needle in, and then he very carefully withdraws some fluid with the syringe to make sure it's clear. And he's not in a blood vessel, because if he would inject Novocaine into a blood vessel, he could kill the patient. The fluid is clear. He mixes some of the Novocaine with it in the syringe. He re-injects it, and now, within a minute or so, the patient is unconscious, and he's ready to do his work.
Scalpel.
Moore estimates that his anesthesia will last about roughly an hour and a half. He figures that's probably going to be enough time to finish this operation. And he finds the appendix rather quickly. It's adhered to the cecum, which is not a good sign.
The appendix is attached to Platter's intestine. Moore slowly and carefully pries the appendix free.
And he has to be very conscious of not puncturing the appendix, which is filled with all this pus and material from the infection.
The 30-minute surgery appears to be a success. The rest of the crew is relieved. Below periscope depth, the only way to monitor traffic from the Japanese base at Rabaul is through their hydrophones, listening for threats. But when Moore tries to close up his patient, he discovers bleeding inside Platter's abdomen.
He thought if there was a bleeder, it was inside the patient. And having not found it, he's worried that he's going to sew him up, and he's going to continue to hemorrhage, and he's going to die of internal hemorrhage.
Moore wheels Platter's intestine slowly through his hands, searching for the source of the blood, but he finds nothing. 10 minutes slip past, then 30, and finally an hour. Platter's anesthetic starts to wear off.
You come around, and when your intestine is hanging out of an incision, it's going to hurt, most likely, and Platter begins to moan, and it doesn't take many seconds for someone to realize our patient is waking up, and the operation's not over.
Moore instructs Davenport, Silverside's second in command, to open some ether to sedate Platter.
Ether is a very volatile material. It tends to settle along the floor, generally even in an operating room, but it's very volatile, it's very explosive. And the blowers are going, so anything that takes place in the atmosphere in this boat is going to be generalized to the whole boat. So pretty soon everyone on the boat is going to smell ether. So ether was not recommended for submarine service.
Nervously, Davenport spills ether onto the patient. Right away, Stiegel, who's holding the incision open using bent spoons, begins to feel woozy himself.
Davenport splashes the ether into the mask. He doesn't quite understand, and you wouldn't if you weren't trained, that you need to drip it at a certain rate, and it's a very slow rate. So if you pour it, you're giving the patient much too much ether.
Moore's amateur assistants now add to the threats the patient faces. Calmly interrupting the procedure, Moore moves over to show Davenport how to administer ether properly. With the correct dose, Stiegel also feels better. Moore returns to the surgery. For 2.5 hours, Moore searches for the source of the blood and realizes there's nothing more he can do. Moore begins to suture his patient up, knowing the unidentified source of bleeding might cost Platter his life.
As he's closing, and he's doing this almost under protest within himself. He knows something is dreadfully wrong. He doesn't know what the source of the blood is. But as he's closing, he sees the bleeder. It's right there in front of him. He realizes a clamp has slipped. He can fix this. This is easy. And he does. He fixes it within seconds. The bleeder is taken care of. He breathes a sigh of relief that he has not left this patient hemorrhaging. Put yourself in that situation where you're called upon to save a human life, and you have very few things to work with, except your skill and good luck. Tom Moore's efforts on that particular day were heroic. There's no question. The word heroism is the only word that I would use to describe what he did.
Almost 4 hours after they first submerged the submarine for the surgery, Burlingame orders Silversides to the surface. They need to charge their batteries. A little after 3 a.m., lookouts spot a darkened ship. All agree that it appears to be a submarine. Burlingame works his way around to better identify it.
Burlingame suspects this could be another American vessel, so he heads to the west, and when he does so, he crosses a moon slick, and the lookouts on the other vessel spot him.
The vessel turns towards Silversides and begins to approach. His lookouts report the vessel closing in.
Burlingame orders his signalman to flash a recognition signal in Morse code.
The vessel continues to charge. A second signal is answered with a green flashing light. It's not Morse code. It is definitely an enemy vessel. Burlingame orders all head full to outrun the ship. Then he orders the crew to battle stations to ready their stern torpedoes. As the pursuer closes to 4,000 yards, Silversides fires. The first torpedo explodes prematurely 2,000 yards from Silversides. The second torpedo fails to hit. The enemy continues to close the distance on the submarine.
Clear the bridge!
They don't have time to set up another attack. Burlingame orders they dive to get out of the range of possible depth charges. Topside, the enemy ship prepares to drop special underwater bombs to sink submarines called depth charges.
Submarines are invisible if you're on the surface. So if you want to attack a submarine, there has to be some way of getting close to it, even if you don't know exactly where it is. During World War I, the British discovered that if you explode something very close to a submarine, it'll sink it. The water will act as a hammer, it'll punch in the submarine. So they invented depth charge. Depth charge is a can of explosive fused in such a way that when it hits a certain set depth, it goes off.
The sailors hear the unmistakable click of the depth charge detonation switches.
Some of the men described it as the sound of two rocks clicking together. And at that point, everyone throughout the boat is just holding on really for dear life, waiting for that charge to explode.
The first of 4 depth charges explodes astern of Silversides.
You guess the depth of the submarine. Typically, you drop a lot of depth charges. You're supposed to do it in a pattern so that even if your guess is wrong, you'll probably get the sub or shake it up badly.
The attacker drops a second barrage.
Coming at us. Brace!
The enemy ship 300 feet above stops to pinpoint the submarine below. It uses sonar pings to locate the sub. Silversides must evade this new threat and return to its mission of stopping Japanese ships reinforcing Guadalcanal.
You guess the depth of the submarine. Typically, you drop a lot of depth charges. You're supposed to do it in a pattern so that even if your guess is wrong, you'll probably get the sub or shake it up badly.
The attacker drops a second barrage.
Coming at us. Brace!
enemy ship 300 feet above stops to pinpoint the submarine below. It uses sonar pings to locate the sub. Silversides must evade this new threat and return to its mission of stopping Japanese ships reinforcing Guadalcanal. Southwest Pacific, December 1942. 50 miles off the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul, USS Silversides is under attack. A Japanese destroyer targets the submarine with depth charges. The ship stops overhead and performs a sonar search for the submarine. The men can hear the vessel above. They listen in silence.
You know, the Japanese anti-submarine operations, both equipment and tactics, are very infant, even at the beginning of the World War II. Japanese Navy allocated almost all the possible resources on the battleships and cruisers and destroyers. Anti-submarine capability of Imperial Japanese Navy is left behind.
The Japanese Navy has made one other miscalculation. American submarines can dive 20 to 30% deeper than their own subs.
So the depth set to detonate is much shallower than the U.S. submarine's real diving capability. So there are some mismatches, together with the Japanese less developed equipment and tactics.
Depth charges rattle the submarine, but none come close enough to inflict serious damage. As morning breaks, Burlingame creeps up to periscope depth. But the destroyer charges and drives them back down. On their second approach, the skipper finally gets a good look at his attacker. It's a two-stack destroyer. Burlingame considers a counterattack, but they are too far away. He watches the destroyer disappear over the horizon. As the threat passes, Burlingame uses the opportunity to get some rest.
On combat patrol, crews are often up for days at a time, and this can really lead to exhaustion and the possibility of mistakes.
Sailors collapse into their bunks. Some have been on duty for 30 hours. But they don't sleep for long. A periscope sweep just before 9 a.m. reveals a Japanese plane overhead.
Now, periscope. Get the captain.
Before Silversides can dive deeper, the plane drops 3 death bombs. Burlingame is violently tossed from his bunk.
Glass shower down on Burlingame, and in the forward and after torpedo rooms, sailors are literally cut by flying glass, and others are tossed out of their bunks. Every man standing is thrown off his feet. Burlingame later described it as feeling like the conning tower was about to be wrenched from the pressure hull. The explosion was so powerful even that the tacks on the cork began to pop out. In the wardroom, Platter, who's recovering from a surgery, is tossed off of the transom onto the deck.
Burlingame and his crew scramble to battle stations. Worthington takes over as diving officer and forces the submarine into a steep dive as they wait for the next round of attack. A blast has burst a pipe in the pump room. In the control room, Worthington discovers another problem.
Top plane's jammed. Here, get up. Shift to hand.
2 sets of diving planes, one at the stern and another set at the bow, control the pitch of the submarine, moving the sub up and down. The submarine's bow planes have jammed into a hard dive.
Your problem with the bow planes is that if you keep going forward and the planes are jammed down, you'll keep going down. You can try to take manual control of the planes, and there are wheels that allow you to adjust them, although the wheels are not normally used. It's a very hard job physically.
Worthington and his crew struggle to manually reset the bow planes.
Take over.
Submarines are designed to operate down to a certain depth because the structure can only take so much water pressure. Typically what happens is you have a rated depth, and then below that there's a crush depth or collapse depth. If you go below collapse depth, the name will come through and it'll be like that.
They must regain control of the submarine before it's too late. December 1942. In the Southwest Pacific, an American submarine is in a forced dive because its diving planes were damaged by a depth charge attack.
Pump 1,000 pounds, forward trim, aft trim.
It takes 15 minutes to get control of the bow planes by hand operation. The submarine levels off short of crush depth. To add insult to injury, the Japanese destroyer in the area returns and makes another run. They drop another round of depth charges overhead. Eventually, the ship-shuttering attacks come to an end.
Burlingame is rattled at this point. Rather than face another attack, he opts to stay submerged until after dark. He later in his patrol report said this was the most unpleasant day he ever put in.
Yet praised their patient, whom Burlingame said convalesced to the tune of a torpedo firing, 2 depth charge attacks, 2 crash dives, and an aerial bombardment, which knocked Platter out of his bunk. Remarkably, George Platter returns to duty 6 days after the surgery. At 7:42 p.m. on December 23rd, Silverside surfaces to assess their situation.
Damage report.
Silverside takes damage that looks very impressive at the beginning. The worst of it is that the planes are jammed down. They have other things. Antennas are mashed up, periscope is broken. At that time, probably that was regarded as pretty serious damage. Later in the war, that would be described as superficial.
Critically, though, Silverside still travels under its own power.
His diesels still work. He's able to make high speed on the surface. That was one of the great things about the Gale class that Silverside was a unit of.
At 1 a.m. on December 24th, Silverside hobbles into the assigned patrol area between outlying islands of Papua New Guinea. They're supposed to be patrolling off Truk to stop the movement of Japanese troops and materials heading to Guadalcanal. Instead, they use the cover of darkness to make repairs.
Captain, I think we got this under control.
The U.S. submarines were very tough. That meant that you could take a terrible beating and come back in one piece.
Starting on Christmas Day and for the next 3 weeks, Burlingame and his crew stalk sightings. And dive periodically when patrol planes pass overhead. On January 18th, their luck finally changes. The Silverside patrols 90 nautical miles southwest of Truk.
We got a tanker up here.
Lookouts spot a large tanker.
Get the captain up here!
Tankers matter because oil matters. The world runs on oil. It runs on oil in World War II. It runs on oil now. If you can cut off the oil supply, it's over. In the Japanese case, tankers are even more important because Japan doesn't produce any oil. So the oil has to come from elsewhere.
The tanker travels a zigzag course with a patrol boat escort. Burlingame begins a submerged approach around 2:20 a.m.
Stand by torpedoes.
By 2:55, Silverside is in position. The 4 stern tubes are loaded and ready.
Fire!
Less than a minute after the first torpedo is fired, it strikes the bow of the tanker. A huge column of spray, white in the moonlight, obscures the bow of the ship. Second and third torpedoes hit amidships. Smoke and flames burst from the tanker. The pillar, Burlingame estimates, is easily 200 feet high. But the battle is not over. A patrol boat charges towards Silversides.
Down periscope, take us deep.
Burlingame commences evasive tactics and orders the submarine deeper. But the tanker's escort streaks across Silverside's stern and drops 8 explosive depth charges. Detonations knock out gauges and blow off a gasket. Air escapes to the surface, betraying their position to the Japanese escort. The enemy ship drops another barrage of depth charges, which does more damage to the submarine. After 10 minutes, the charges grow distant. By 7 a.m., the enemy ship reverses course and pulls out of sight. With more repair work, Silversides is able to return to its patrol. 2 days later, and 286 miles from Truk, Silversides nears the end of its patrol when smoke is sighted on the horizon.
Captain, 5 degrees.
Burlingame closes in until he identifies 4 freighters. Conditions are too clear for a daytime attack. For 6 hours, the submarine stalks the convoy.
By dusk, they know its zigzag plan, its speed, and its course.
At 6:18 p.m., they begin a submerged approach, and all 6 forward torpedo tubes are prepped and ready.
Suddenly, the convoy zigs away, and if they shoot now, there's no guarantee that their torpedoes will hit.
One of the escort ships turns directly towards their position.
He's picked up our screws.
But an unusual setup has developed. All ships are now in an overlapping formation. So if Burlingame's gonna shoot, he has to do it now.
Let's get rid of these fish. Fire!
Fire!
They launch 6 torpedoes into the cluster of ships. At the same time, the patrol boat closes in on the submarine. Burlingame lowers the periscope and orders the submarine deep.
Just before they dive, the crew hears the sounds of 5 torpedoes hitting, followed by the sounds of ships breaking up. The patrol boat performs a sonar search for the Silversides, then drops 6 rounds of depth charges.
But unknown to the crew, a greater threat remains aboard the submarine. While they heard 5 torpedoes strike, it turns out they should have been worried about the 6th.
Let's get rid of these fish. Fire!
Fire!
About 286 miles south of Truk, USS Silversides fires 6 torpedoes at a Japanese convoy. The crew believes that they have sunk 3 ships. Below periscope depth, they cannot confirm the kills. The Navy grants them 1 sunk and 2 damaged for the record. Their attack attracts another round of enemy depth charges. then develops another potentially troublesome air leak. Silversides has survived, but at a cost.
The Silversides is so mired in electrical and mechanical problems at this point from all the attacks it's endured that it's beginning to become a liability. A submarine's main tactical advantage is its ability to hide. And if air bubbles are giving away its location, then it loses that tactical advantage.
The crew must find a solution.
The next night, Burlingame sends a diver overboard to investigate the air leaks. And the diver discovers that 5 of the torpedoes left the tubes, but the 6th one dangles from the bow, a ticking time bomb.
Burlingame has a serious problem. He must eject the armed torpedo without exploding it.
If anything goes wrong with the torpedo when you fire it, if, for example, it just sticks in the tube, you worry that anything you do may set it off, and it's quite enough to blow the front end of your sub off and sink you.
The plan is unusual, but it may be their only hope. Burlingame will simply fire the torpedo out of the tube again, while simultaneously backing away at high speed. There's a risk the torpedo will detonate, but it's their best bet to expel the defective warhead.
Throughout the Silversides, the men were quiet, pale, anxiously waiting to see whether or not this would work.
All back emergency.
The submarine shudders as the diesel engines go into reverse at top speed. A thin wake spurts from the bow of the sub.
There she goes.
Travels off into the distance, then disappears. With the ongoing mechanical issues, Burlingame decides to leave the patrol area 2 days ahead of schedule. And on January 31st, 1943, after 47 days, USS Silversides ends her 4th war patrol at Pearl Harbor. Silversides has gotten up close to the enemy and paid the price. But despite a string of disasters, Silversides and her crew pull through.
In their report, they list everything that goes wrong, among other things, so that back home afterwards, the builders of further submarines will know what to worry about. It's the best test you could get. One of the jobs of a patrol report is to lay out everything that went wrong. What went right, you don't talk about, so that it can be fixed.
Back on shore, a Navy medical officer, Dr. Hart, attacks Tom Moore's decision to perform an amateur appendectomy at sea and threatens him with court-martial. Burlingame intervenes on behalf of the pharmacist's mate, and Admiral Chester Nimitz leaks the story to the press. All threats against Thomas Moore cease. Post-war analysis reveals USS Silverside sank 3 of the enemy ships they fired at. They'd also learned the ships were loaded with Japanese reinforcements. American forces continue to consolidate their hold on Guadalcanal. By February, the island is completely in American hands. The fighting is won by ground forces, but submarines like Silversides disrupt shipping and the arrival of reinforcements, making it increasingly difficult for the Japanese to fight back.
But, that's a kind of the body blow of the 13-round boxing game. If your question is there any immediate visible impact, the answer is no. But, accumulation of the gains by the submarines became the body blow of the Japanese defensive posture on the Solomon Islands, starting from the Guadalcanal.
1942 is a big learning curve for these American skippers, and by 1943, the lessons have been learned, and the skippers are really starting to hit their stride.
After a full overhaul, Burlingame and USS Silversides are ordered back out on patrol.
What you're watching is a submarine has been damaged, but the damage isn't fatal. So Silversides has taken a beating, and what that teaches the crew and the captain and others is you can survive even if they find you.
Commanders like Creed Burlingame have set an aggressive example for the skippers that are going to follow them as America heads into the second full year of the war.
Silversides would complete 14 patrols and survive the war. It rests today in Muskegon, Michigan as a museum, an ongoing testament to an extraordinary history.